Yes, absolutely. So let me share my screen as well. All right. So what I will be trying to do is to give an overall background to Macron's presidency and the social crisis that France is undergoing by putting it in the wider context of the country's political economy since the 80s. So without a doubt, Macron's presidency has been one of the most turbulent of the Fifth Republic. Every attempt his government made to implement its neoliberal policy program has been made by massive popular resistance. Only a couple of months after his election, his labor market reforms were already met by strong opposition and strike action from unions. His widely contested pro-rich tax reform, so the uprising of the Gilets jaunes movement that Soraya talked about, which sent shockwaves throughout the French establishment, and the pension reform after that the government initiated, so the rise of a strike movement not seen in 25 years. So for every significant reform that the government implemented, Macron also had to deal with a massive social movement rising against it. At the same time, this social resistance was matched by the government's authoritarian response. And this authoritarian response included mass police crackdowns on protesters, which even Amnesty International condemned as being, a threat to the right to protest, never seen before. And I'm quoting there. In the middle of the pandemic, the government voted for another very controversial security bill that increases police rights and intensifies the everyday use of drones by police, characteristically. And just a couple of days ago, as part of his pre-electoral campaign, Macron promised to further boost the police force of the country and expand it by 10,000 by the end of his presidency. So you have a very conflictual situation, right? So you have social movements that refuse the implementation of painful economic reforms and resist them. And you have a government that, in order to implement them, will not hesitate to have recourse to quite authoritarian means. And what I want to suggest is that this conflictual situation is the symptom, let's say, of an underlying pathology of the French political economy, whereby existing forms of managing social discontent become increasingly inadequate and are being progressively replaced by more authoritarian ones. And I think that to understand this process, this crisis, we need to go back 40 years ago, and we need to go back to the 80s. So in the 80s, and in the context of a very intense economic crisis, the French state underwent a neoliberal turn that through which it sought to restructure and reorganize the domestic economy along more competitive lines. And to do so, it undertook important changes in labor law, encouraged the rationalization of domestic industry, and initiated large privatization programs. And the problem with all these reforms is that they came at a growing social cost, right? As unemployment soared, and in general, it left workers worse off, as these new labor laws weakened their bargaining power. And inevitably, the reforms pursued by the French state during that era were resisted by workers. So how do you address this situation where painful economic measures are allegedly necessary to improve competitiveness, but people are justifiably ready to battle and resist them in order to protect their livelihood. So what do? What the French state did in the 80s to address this specter of revolt, what it did is that they initiated a mode of managing social discontent that Jonah Levy calls the social anesthesia state. So what is what is the social anesthesia state? Is a series of social and unemployment benefits that the French state initiated in order to essentially buy social peace. So in order to avoid mass revolt by those that were set to lose out from economic reforms, the French state accompanied all these economic reforms with social measures that sought to diffuse social discontent. And as a result, France has become the biggest social spender in the OECD. It has basically the most expensive welfare state in the OECD. And the French state basically dedicates a great share of its resources towards financing this social anesthesia state. And in this graph, this graph that I've shared from the OECD basically shows where France stands in terms of social spending relative to other countries. And the black line is the average social spending in the OECD. And France basically is at the top because of this very expensive welfare state that it developed in order to buy social peace. So all good. The French state managed to find a temporary way to wed the objectives of economic reform and maintaining some form of social stability. However, the social anesthesia strategy is also encountering very important limits. And for me, the biggest limit is the overall waning dynamism of the French economy. So in the following graph that I've used, that I'm sharing here, basically it shows the waning productivity of the French economy. So without going into much details, what this means is that the rate at which wealth is produced in the economy does not grow as fast as it used to. You see how it decelerates from the 60s, from the mid 70s and onwards. So it decelerates. So that means that the resources essentially that could be distributed are dwindling. So, and this has severe consequences on people's incomes, which have remained stagnant for decades. And, less high-paying jobs are created and more precarious jobs are created. And it also has consequences for public finances, as it limits the resources available to the state. And this is not a French-specific phenomenon. This is a global phenomenon, this deceleration of productivity growth. All countries experience it. In the UK, it's famous under the productivity puzzle. So it's something that all countries experience, developed countries at least. But the problem is, for France, the specific problem is that it started building a massive welfare state at a period when this economic downturn was underway. So the French economy has not been performing as well as it used to, and as such, this social anesthesia state becomes relatively expensive since wealth is not produced fast enough to accommodate for the growing costs of this welfare state. And the other problem of the social anesthesia state is that for French reformers, for French state elites, this welfare state inhibits economic performance and it undermines French competitiveness. So the problem is, long story short, that for French state elites, this massive welfare state costs a lot to employers. It contributes to declining competitiveness because firms are less keen to invest, given all the taxes that they basically have to pay to contribute to this welfare state. So these are the problems with the social anesthesia state. And again, you have a very conflictual situation whereby, you know, there are pressures that pull into two different directions. So there are significant economic pressures that compel the French state to dismantle its welfare state. And on the other, you have people and workers that are much less ready to see this welfare state gone, because it provides important support to people, especially in the context of this worsening economy that I just described. So the dismantlement of the social anesthesia state comes at a high social cost that people understandably are not ready to pay. So Macron's turbulent and, you know, increasingly authoritarian presidency demonstrates the increasing inability of the French state to contain social discontent through the expansion of its welfare state. And instead, the growing recourse to authoritarian practices becomes a much easier way to manage social conflict in the current era. So the French government is essentially called to dismantle the social anesthesia state, all this massive welfare state, but there is nothing to replace it aside from flashballs, drones, and tear gas. So just to conclude and to link all this story with the coming elections, obviously everyone can see how disastrous an election of Le Pen will be. There's no doubt about it. And she has very successfully capitalized on the existing social crisis that I just described. But at the same time, it's very hard to find comfort in any of the other political programs that are proposed by the other parties. Some, like Macron, just want to increase the existing trajectory towards the dismantlement of the welfare state, which is socially unsustainable, and others simply deny the problem. So either way, I think that the problem that I described, this tension between dismantling the economic pressures to dismantle the social anesthesia state and the social pressures to keep it, basically, will confront any aspiring government. And this is the reason that I don't think that this pressure, these tensions can be solved electorally because of these deeper structural problems that underlie French capitalism. And we must see the elections in light of this dilemma. So that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexis. Thomas, whenever you're ready, you can go ahead.
Thank you very much, Alex. Thank you very much for the invitation. I hope you understand me when I'm speaking. I took my vaccine this morning, so I'm kind of feeling a little, I don't know, fever and headache. So I hope I will be able to do my presentation in a comprehensible way, and I hope you understand it. I will kind of repeat some stuff that had been said by Soraya and by Alexis, but I, of course, will try to introduce my own perspective on this. As Soraya pointed out, when Macron was elected in 2017, and I think it is important to have this background, he ended up destroying the two main political parties in France, the Socialist Party and which is now called the Republican Party. Of course, the Socialist Party was partially already destroyed by the former president, François Hollande, who did a very problematic government. There were many terrorist attempts during his presidency, but most importantly, he promised during the election that he would do a left-wing or a center left-wing government. And in fact, he just continued the economic policies from the center right. So basically the left lost its most important party, the Socialist Party. The center right had a chance to win the elections in 2017, but for reasons that you cannot predict. I mean, their candidate was involved in a scandal during the election, and Macron suddenly, this not exactly an outsider, but someone that was not from the two biggest parties, and someone who was presenting himself as a centrist, he ends up being elected, and more than that, he ends up having a majority in the parliament. Um, since then, Macron has governed, at least at the institutional level, kind of unopposed. There's no electoral opposition to him in terms of political parties in the parliament. I mean, the socialists, they lost their strength. The center right, basically, Macron implements their program. So what? How can they criticize Macron if in the end Macron is doing what they would do if they were in power? And the other parties, they are too small to have a voice. So of course, yes, in the end we had this social discontent expressed in the streets, but let's say that Macron could approve anything that he wanted. Since
No.
then, however, sorry, okay. Since then, however, we saw an important reduction of his popularity ratings, of his approval ratings. And if he was elected with 2/3 of the votes, nowadays, in fact, he's not polling that well. In fact, since then, in every single election that we had in France, Macron ended up losing to a certain extent. He lost the European elections, he lost the regional elections, and last year, during the municipal election, the city elections, he lost. It was a debacle. I mean, he didn't win a single relevant city in the whole country. So he is this figure that is losing power and does not have a real party structure and a real local, how can I say it, presence in France. Even his party that used to have the majority in the National Assembly, in Parliament, it still has a majority, let's say, but a big part of MPs ended up leaving his party. And nowadays, he has barely a majority. I mean, he can still approve stuff because even those who were discontent still vote with the government, but basically he succeeded to lose one part of his electoral majority. So what we are dealing with is a fragile president in terms of approval ratings and electoral force. Nevertheless, still, Macron continues to gather and to appeal for a significant part of the electorate. So around at least 20% of the people would vote for him, and this would be enough to put him in the second round. And against whom? Against probably Marine Le Pen, once again, the same candidate that he had defeated 5 years ago now, 4 years and a half ago. Maybe Macron will not even succeed to get there in the first place. I mean, to be the first one in the first round. We don't know it yet, but he would be able probably to go to the second round against Marine Le Pen, mostly because once again the center right is kind of lost and Macron stole their program, and the left is completely divided. If it's not going to happen, but if all the left-wing parties get together, etc., maybe they would be able to represent or to constitute an electoral force. But in reality, they are completely fragmented. People were talking a lot about the Green Party during the municipal elections last year, but in fact, I don't think that they are that strong in terms of national politics. The Socialist Party is very weak. Everybody left after 2017. They consider presenting the mayor of Paris as a presidential candidate, but I don't think she's pulling very well. She's around 5%. It's nothing. And we have the populist radical left, and it's interesting because I think we can discuss it. Soraya talked about the populist anti-populist divide. Well, we have the left-wing radical populist candidate Jean-Luc Mélenchon, but he's over personalistic. I think he suffered many attacks in the previous years. His party was involved in a kind of also scandal. In the end, they were all acquitted, but basically it kind of jeopardized his electoral situation. Basically, these people are not getting together, so the left has no chance to go to the second round. So once again, Macron against Le Pen, probably. What happens that since then also, because Macron lost his popularity, etc., Le Pen is trying to present herself as a more viable candidate, as a mainstream candidate. In fact, it's not a bad thing. Okay, to some part of the electorate, they think, oh, once again, she's part of the system. But in fact, she does it on purpose because she wants to present herself as a viable, as a possible candidate to become president. Because there is a part of the electorate that would consider voting for her if, of course, she's not presented as extremist, as a completely outsider. So for the Front National, it's good to keep, of course, one part of this outside populist dimension, but it's also nice to present their candidate as a mainstream candidate to a certain extent, or to flirt with mainstream politics. And because of this, because of the lack of popularity of Macron, of approval ratings of Macron, and because Marine Le Pen, the mainstreamization, let's say, of mainstreaming of Marine Le Pen, what we in general call the Republican Front in France, the Front Républicain, it's getting weaker. I mean, it has been, we saw the weakness of this Republican Front since 2002, when for the first time in the Fifth Republic it was constituted, when Jacques Chirac, the candidate, the president that was candidate for re-election, had to face the father of Marine Le Pen in the second round, and he was elected with more than 80% of the votes. But instead of doing, how can I say it, a national reconciliation government and bringing people from the left and from the right, no, he just continued his right-wing agenda. And Macron did the same thing in 2017, we can say. He was elected with 66% of the vote, but he governed, he did his liberal reforms, and he governed as a right-winger, a center right-winger. And because of this, more and more, the left-wing voter has less incentive to vote for this Republican Front against fascism or against the extreme right. And I've been doing my research on the Yellow Vest for a while, and among them you have, well, it's a very diverse movement, but many people there say between Macron and Le Pen, I would vote for her or I would stay at home. Even people that historically have voted for the left or haven't voted at all, they will say that between both, I mean, they are the same. For them, it doesn't matter. They would remain at their place, or in the worst case scenario, and I've interviewed people that would vote for the radical left in the first round and for the radical right in the second round, because for them, Macron is unacceptable, let's say. And it's curious because of this polarization between Macron and Le Pen, what we see, instead of Macron trying to present himself as a more, I don't know, centrist candidate, going to the left, no, he considers that the left is kind of already acquired, and instead he's trying to implement and to use the tropes, I don't know, the demands from the extreme right. And more and more and more, we see these appeals, I don't know, the whole discourse against Islamo-leftism, let's say, and how Islam is a problem in France, and how we should also, as Alexis explained, increase the number of policemen, etc., etc. So more and more, he's trying to convince the radical right voter to vote for him, but instead, the only thing I think he's doing is to alienate the left constituency that could vote for him. Later, we can discuss, of course, how the pandemic changed a little bit his government. I don't think it changed it that much, but I would just like to do my, not exactly a forecast, but to explain what I think is going to happen in 2022. Well, 5 years ago, Macron won the elections with 2/3 of the vote. Now, I think it will be much, much, much closer. I would say something around 5%. So something like, I don't know, In the best case scenario, 55-45, probably even less. And in this situation, very small things can change the outcome of the election. So I am Brazilian. I was born in Brazil. I've been living in France for 7 years now. But I mean, we see what fake news can do one day before the election, and you can change a few percent of voters that will not go vote or vote for a candidate or for another, and it can change the outcome of elections. You've seen this in the United Kingdom with a Brexit campaign, and also we've seen this with Donald Trump in the United States. So this kind of stuff, we are vulnerable to this kind of stuff when we have these very close elections. I think I've already talked too much, but I will be very happy to discuss all of this with you. Once again, thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Thomas, and don't worry, that wasn't too long, so don't worry. Elodie, if you want to set up, I'm just going to remind people, if you have any questions whilst you've been listening, you can either send them to me directly and I can read them out for you, or you can even just post them in, the general chat, and we'll go from there. And then we'll have questions once Elodie's finished. All right, if you're ready, Elodie.
Okay, thank you. I apologize. I do not have slides like everyone else. I've entered the mocking turnout right now and have not had time to do this. So you're just going to see my big face, I guess. That's what's going to happen now. So thank you very much for the invitation. And when I was asked to talk about this topic, I thought, what am I going to really focus about? And I started to focus about something that Thomas has just talked about a bit more. It's the ones who don't really matter fundamentally, at least in national election, are very unlikely to matter in the first round, and that's the traditional parties, the pre-2017 traditional parties. And when we look, and that's maybe a little bit of a paradox, because next month France will have elections. There's the 2 rounds of regional elections taking place across the new-ish regions in France, and we will see regions won by mostly La République En Marche, probably the Parti Socialiste in some places as well. There's a question mark about Provence-Alpes-Côte d'Azur, where it could well be the Rassemblement National that wins. But otherwise, you'll see La République En Marche probably failing to be particularly significant. It's going to be in coalition with other parties, mostly the centre-right and the right. But what was said earlier is that over the last 5 years, La République En Marche hasn't really done very well in terms of elections, what you call intermediary elections or second-order election, if you like, regional, local, European Parliament elections. And one of the things is that they've kind of sort of struggled to build local roots that enabled them to win, cities, small towns, villages, etc., and then maybe regions now on their own. However, once we're going to move on to the presidential elections next year and then the parliamentary elections that will follow, again, suddenly it will be about La République En Marche. And it's a bit of a paradox, because we can see that the traditional parties have done relatively well when we've looked at these regional, local elections previously, and that the Europe Écologie Les Verts, the Green Party, did pretty well as well in the European Parliament election, and they did pretty well in last year's local elections, with winning a few more cities, etc. And yet, when we come next year, we will see the left being pretty divided, probably. And the right will also have a candidate, hopefully for them only one. And that can lead us to discussing how they select their candidates. Over the last few years, of the last few election cycles, on the right and on the left, we've seen parties that are close to each other organize open primaries in which anyone who feels close to the ideas of the right, broadly seen, the left, broadly seen, could vote to decide who would be the candidate for the presidential election. And so that's how we've seen for God's sake, nearly Hamon selected 5 years ago on the left, and Fillon as well, and Sarkozy losing big in the first round, and then Fillon in the second, winning in the second round. The poor result of those candidates in the 2017 election really put those primaries in a really poor light, and there are still question marks as to whether there will be new primaries to select the candidates on the right and on the left. On the right, there's a big debate right now. So the leader of the party is not in favor of having a primary. However, a number of people are candidates to be the main candidate for Les Républicains. And so you've got, and their fate, because now they're just, candidates to the candidacy, might be tied to next month's election, because the main candidates so far are all not actually in the parliament. They're not, if you like, national politicians. They are presidents of a region. So you've got the main contender at the moment is a man called Xavier Bertrand. He's been he's been an MP before. He's been a minister under Sarkozy, and then won the region of the north, so closest to the Belgium with the border with Belgium. The next one is Valérie Pécresse, and she's the president of the Île-de-France region, so Paris and around Paris. And the third one is Laurent Wauquiez, who used to be the leader of Les Républicains and is the president of the Auvergne and Rhône region. These are pretty large regions. And of course, them doing well in these elections next month will maybe help them as they try to vie for the candidacy for Les Républicains. Bertrand, because right now he's polling a bit better than the other two, says, well, we don't need a primary. I will be the candidate, but obviously the other ones are not so compliant, and would like to see a primary happen. And we're also seeing a sort of bit of a left-right discussion happening within the party as well, if you like, with Bertrand being more the sort of like maybe Christian democratic, slightly more socially inclined wing of the party, whereas the other two would be more, fiscal stability, think about the debt, etc. All of them agreeing on, security and sort of issues. Of course, we may have a latecomer to this particular battle to become the candidate on the right, with Barnier starting to make comments in the French press. He infamously made some comments with it earlier this week or last week on immigration in France. So he could well be as well throwing his hat in the ring down the line. So we may see a primary if there are too many candidates and no one is willing to withdraw in favor or gather enough support from other potential candidates. On the left, again, it's very uncertain whether there's going to be a primary, probably not, because it was mostly led by the Socialist Party, the others were involved as well. Socialist Party nationally is a spent force at the moment, and so that raises a lot of ambitions. And last month, there was a meeting of the different parts of the left, the different parties, so the Socialist Party, the Greens, La France Insoumise, so Jean-Luc Mélenchon, plus the Communist Party and a whole bunch of smaller parties, because it's an incredibly divided field over there, to discuss the possibility of a common candidate as well. Some are a lot more keener than others, and the one who's the least keen is Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who still think he could actually squeeze, if there's enough division, maybe, and he might make it. I think it's a pipe dream, but he does not lack self-confidence, let's just put it that way, and thinks he could dominate and maybe be that candidate for the left. But again, he's a very abrasive personality, but plus there are also some political divisions on the left. I mean, he's unlikely to be a union candidate there. It was mentioned earlier that Anne Hidalgo, mayor of Paris, it might be a potential candidate there as well. She's not polling particularly well, but few people in that particular axis is polling particularly well at the moment. And so we've got a situation where, as said before, Macron's and La République En Marche have really undermined the two parties. They don't really know how to respond to Macron's appeal. I mean, right now, a recent poll showed that Macron had 42% of supporters of Les Républicains had a positive opinion of Macron, and so that might even be more than many of the potential candidates among Les Républicains. And so even though La République En Marche has not managed to attract many of these voters in those intermediary elections since 2017, so some of them might return to Macron because they don't see who can win or who might be a strong enough candidate against Le Pen, because no one is in doubt that she's going to be in the election in the second round here. So we're seeing those traditional parties have really struggled to position themselves against that appeal of Macron. Soraya made really an interesting contribution. I thought that sort of anti-populism, which was interesting because others referred to Macron sort of technocratic populist as well. But that was an appeal of not being left, not being right, was part of his appeal, and his really the strong points of his candidacy. That one of the core elements of his candidacy was about not being on the left, not being on the right, trying to depoliticize a lot of these issues, and then biting a little bit as well on increasingly moving it to discuss, national identity. Right now, we're seeing a lot of discussions about Islam and laicity, etc. And so you're really seeing these parties really struggling to really make headways against Macron here. So we're in a really strange situation. That's going to be my conclusion here, where local and regional party systems are seemingly becoming quite different from the national party system, with La République En Marche being very successful nationally, or pretty successful nationally, but failing to really develop strong enough roots and support locally to replace the traditional parties there. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Elodie. And before I start asking the questions that I'm very thankful for everyone for asking, I'd just like to thank the 4 panelists for coming along and presenting their cases, and it's a very interesting topic, and we'll have to see what happens next year. Right, so the first question is from Javier, and I guess it's sort of broadly asking all 4 panelists, so I don't know, you can just answer if you want. So what is the social composition of the Front National's electoral coalition? How does that affect the political economy of its policy agenda? So if anyone wants to answer that question, I don't mind.
I'm happy to give a tentative answer to this question, which yeah, it's a very important question. So as far as I know, and some of my colleagues here might know a bit better, but as far as I know, the social composition of the Front National is quite diverse. So it has managed to attract some of the blue collar vote, etc. Although this should not be exaggerated, because a lot of the blue collar vote is just abstenting. Are absentees basically. Sorry, I couldn't find the verb here. But it also has others from other classes that are more appealed, let's say, by the nationalist discourse, or the at times rhetoric on the EU, etc. So there is a quite diverse social composition where you have both blue collar workers and also representatives from other, social classes more higher up, and people who would also benefit from some neoliberal policy reforms. So how does that impact the political economy of its policy agenda? I think the Front National has a very interesting history. Like, if you go back to the 80s, it was quite the neoliberal party. Like, if you look at the discourses of Le Pen in the 80s, it was Reagan, right? It was basically, we don't want the state, we want the market, and, very, very neoliberal kind of discourse. And then subsequently it has, and more recently, it has sort of shifted this discourse, and now I think it's quite mixed. You have occasionally spurts of leftist rhetorics, let's say, economically, from Le Pen, and saying that we need a welfare state for the French, and we need to protect them from this relentless economic globalization. But I think, and this is just a thought, I think it has sort of more, now the discourse is much more mixed, and I think it tries to downplay the sort of its economic policy program, let's say, because of its diverse social composition. I think that's the case. So it tries to emphasize other questions, security, the nationalist question, EU, etc., because the economic question might divide a little bit more its electorate. And this has also very important implications if it ever comes to power, because in the context of the dilemma that I mentioned earlier, so the neoliberal dismantlement of the welfare state and maintaining that social anesthesia state, so the Le Pen will have, the government will have to make tough choices, which might as well go against the interests, let's say, of some of its electorate, and that might self-undermine that part itself. But that's as far as I can go with that question. But there is a very good book recently written by Bruno Amable and Stefano Palombarini, and they detail very well the political crisis of today, and they talk very clearly about these divisions within the Front National as well. So yeah, I mean, I think they're a good source as well.
All right, thank you. Does anyone else want to answer, or?
Yeah, I would like to add something, please. Just to add something after what Alexis said, and I think you're completely right when you said that the electorate of the Front National is very diverse. I just want to add, like, a small precision, is that it also has, I would say, sort of geographical sort of divide, okay, with, for example, like, this is something that has been said quite a lot, that in the north of France, like especially in very more deprived area like the Nord-Pas-de-Calais, it's more sort of a social vote of sort of a deprived working class. And if you go more into the south, like the Région PACA around Nice, and more into the south east of France, I would say it's not really a social vote, but more like a cultural vote, where people vote more for the Front National because they're part of the upper classes, and they have, I would say, what we call in French the vote identitaire. So you find a lot of people who vote for the Front National in the south of France, who are really into a national identity. For example, you find former what we call the Pieds Noirs in France, which basically were the people, the French, the European settlers that used to live in Algeria, so the former colony of France. So I would say that, yes, you have really this divide between the North and the South. And I think that it was not always easy for Marine Le Pen to to deal with this kind of opposition. But definitely, I will agree with Alexis when he says that there is like the electorate of the Front National is quite heterogeneous. And that's it.
Thank you. If anyone else wants to...
I would agree with what's just been said. Though coming from the south myself, I could say it's much more of a cross class appeal rather than just a posh people appeal. I come from a place that is now a National Front constituency, and so it's across the broad boards, but it's very much more, yes, as Soraya said, a sort of cultural national identity dimension. It's not, though these are areas that have traditionally had a higher levels of unemployment than the national average. And there's a very strong cultural dimension, and indeed the strong presence of a lot of Pieds Noirs is a factor indeed.
All right, thank you. Thomas, do you want to jump in, or should we move on?
We can move on. I think they already...
Okay.
Good.
Right, so this sort of touches on a similar sort of vein as this sort of regional conversation we're having. So what is that? Frank wants to know what exactly is the housing situation in France, and is there a geographical disparity in house prices somewhat similar to that within the United Kingdom that we have here at the moment? I guess again, it's sort of asking anyone who wants to hop in.
What I can say is that, I mean, in the big cities and notably in Paris, it's much, much more expensive than elsewhere in the country. It's clear. I mean, I've been traveling a lot to interview yellow vest protesters, and they claim, and in fact they live in precarity, you can say, in a vulnerable situation. But I've been visiting them in their places in the countryside, and they live in very big houses, stuff that it will be impossible to buy if you live in a big city. So of course the housing price is very different from one region to another, but I think that my French colleagues can even say it better than I.
Well, that may not be the best place to talk because I haven't lived in France in nearly 20 years. But yeah, you do have that sort of capital versus everywhere else to a degree. And then if you're in the south, there's, again, it's the prices are nowhere near like in England or anything, but the combination of sunshine plus easy transport links between Paris and the south have seen, I mean, it's not a recent thing, but when the high-speed trains got a lot faster, they were all fast and then they got faster at least 10 years ago, that made a lot of people commuting even more, and that led to a slight increase in prices. And then if you go even farther along to Tarrant's, you know, PACA and Côte d'Azur and all that, it is quite expensive over there again, but there's a clear social element, plus people retiring then there, etc., because sunshine.
All right, if everyone's happy with that, should we move on to the next question? So this question is from Tron, and he says, given that the French presidential election will be much closer than 2017, what do you think this what do you think will be the increases of the chances of a cohabitation, given that either if Macron wins, there will not be a strong coattails effect, and if Le Pen wins, the voting system does not favor the Rassemblement National, what will what will be the implications of cohabitation either with Macron or Le Pen?
This is, I'm sorry to start to speak, but this is a question that I find really interesting because it's, for me, it's really unpredictable. I have to admit, I've been doing some forecasts today, so it's bad that it's being recorded, because in the future maybe people will see it and say that I was wrong. But in 2017, for instance, I thought, okay, Macron has no local roots. I mean, his party is a new party. He will be elected, but he will not have a majority in parliament. That was my forecast at the time. And I was completely wrong. Why did I think that Macron would not have a majority in parliament? Basically because we had some constituencies where the Socialist Party or the center-right parties had been in power for, I don't know, 70 years. And you don't think that from one day to another, they will simply switch to another party. But indeed, many of these places did it. And so what we've learned in 2017 is that the president, the elected president, has a boost, let's say, in the parliamentary elections. It happened in 2017. Of course, nowadays, Macron's popularity is smaller than it was 5 years ago. But one phenomenon that we see is that many people who lost the elections, let's say, are not going to vote in the parliamentary elections. So maybe he would succeed to continue to have a majority, but maybe not. And it will be interesting to see it for another reason, because since 2002, I think, before, in fact, since, yeah, I mean, the presidential election and the parliamentary elections, they go together. Let's say you elect the president, and 1 month later you have the legislative elections. And since then, the possibility of cohabitation, I mean, many people consider that it would be impossible to have it nowadays, because the president will always have the majority after. And because the two terms take exactly the same time, the president will have a majority all the time. When cohabitation had happened in the past, when the parliament had 7-year term, the president had a 7-year term and the parliament had just 5-year term, which means that by the 5th year of a president's term, there will be a new election. Probably he would not be polling very well, and he would be forced to accept a prime minister from the opposition. I don't know. So basically, I am not doing any forecast. I'm just saying that it will be complicated to think of cohabitation in the current situation. I'd like to know what the others have to say about it.
I would tend to agree. I mean, in the scenario where Macron wins. So Macron, as actually Thomas has just said, has La République En Marche have lost their parliamentary majority through defections, a few by-elections, etc. But they're governing with the Modem, which is one of center-right parties that are also in government. So there's, if you'd like, it's not really cohabitation, it's a governing majority. And that would probably be what we're likely to see. I mean, and also because they've been expanding that sort of rightwards outreach. You've seen some of the, some people, we're seeing it right now actually with the situation with the regional elections, where the mayor of, the president of the region in Provence-Alpes-Côte d'Azur, Renaud Muselier, is from Les Républicains, but he's included people from La République En Marche in his list. So none of the big names from La République En Marche, but you know, you've got a section of Les Républicains who are Macron compatible. The mayor of Nice, Christian Estrosi, has just left Les Républicains because he's more of that Macron compatible wing of the party. So these are people who could also be brought in to help. If, God forbid, Le Pen wins, though, I think we're much more likely to see a difficult parliamentary majority, because then, even if her candidates get into a lot of second rounds, you will see more people pulling together against the candidate of the Front National, Rassemblement National. And I guess even though one of the things that was very noticeable in the last presidential election was the shock of Le Pen being in the second round was nothing like it has been in 97. And that explains the differential that was observed earlier between Le Pen father score against Chirac and Le Pen daughter against Macron. But I think I'd like to think that a Le Pen victory in the presidential election would actually wake a few people up and motivate them to go and vote in the parliamentary election. But one can only hope.
All right, thank you. Does anyone else want to add anything to that, or?
Yeah, maybe quickly.
That's all right.
Yeah, but just a very quick comment. I think the same as Thomas, I wouldn't do any prediction for this election because I would be too scared to look stupid. And especially because 4 years ago, I thought that Macron wouldn't pass the first round, and see, he won the election. So I would not dare trying a sort of prediction, but I would say that even if it happened, like if a cohabitation would actually happen, honestly, I don't think how we could actually survive on the long term, because the last time we had a cohabitation, okay, was not that, so it was not a long time ago. It was between Chirac and Jospin, so between the center right and the center left. At the time, okay, they did have some disagreements, but overall, I think we can say that the last 30 years, the center right and the center left have led more or less the same kind of policy, especially on the economic front, more or less neoliberal policy, and Front Républicain to prevent Marine Le Pen from the Front National from winning. So yeah, so what I think is that the disagreements between Jospin and Chirac at the time were manageable for the cohabitation to survive. But with Marine Le Pen and Macron, I mean, there's just an entire, like a huge gap ideologically between them. And I think that it would be very, very chaotic and probably lead to the president to dissolve the assembly and bring some new legislative elections. I mean, that is how I would see the picture, more or less.
All right, thank you. So I've been sent a question privately. Oh, sorry, are you talking? No? Okay. So this question is for you, Alexis. So given France's imperial history has left a bit of legacy of racial inequality in France, is France's social anesthesia state similarly racialized? Further, if the social anesthesia state were dismantled, would this necessarily mean heightened state repression of poor racial minorities in France?
Yeah, that's such an important question, and yeah, no, it's a lot to think about, and I can only try and give elements of an answer rather than a very complete and coherent answer to that. But I think that yeah, put in this context, I think that's towards where the situation is headed. So if we think about, where is poverty concentrated, where is precarity concentrated in France, and which minorities also suffer more from this poverty and precarity, then undoubtedly this progressive dismantlement of the social anesthesia state will, yeah, no doubt heighten the already very tense you know, discourses on race and etc. in France. So I think that yes, I mean, absolutely, it will have consequences, because a lot of the people who depend on the social anesthesia state are you know, come from you know, these minorities, and I think that yeah, these neoliberal policy reforms will only accentuate this situation. Sorry, I cannot. I think it's a very important question, and I think that I lack the you know, all the knowledge necessary to give a complete answer to that. But the simple answer is that yes, I think that it will accentuate the current you know, racialized kind of discourse in France, and it will have grave repercussions. But I think I will stop here, because I'm not sure I can give a much more coherent answer.
All right, thank you. If anyone else has any questions, we're still open to any questions. So I'm just going to wait a minute, or I might even ask my own question. It might sound a bit silly, but yesterday I was in a phone call with my grandma, and she's always updating me what's the climate in France. And interestingly, she gave me this phrase yesterday from La République en Marche. She said, "La République Emmanuel Macron," and sort of the way that they've been paralyzing him, you know, with, you know, Napoleon, he's the new Napoleon and things. Is there what's the implication of this maybe for next year? I don't know if it has any effect, but I just thought it was interesting. I don't, anyone can answer if you want.
Can you repeat a little bit the question, maybe?
So sort of more broadly, in terms of Macron's personality, what is it? What's the direct effect of that on sort of the elections next year?
Right.
Well, in spite of everything that's happened, he's not that unpopular compared to his predecessor, for instance. So that might sound surprising with all the yellow vests and the pandemic and everything, but he's not as unpopular as, for instance, Hollande was at the same stage of his presidency. The sort of Napoleon thing that you've mentioned go quite differently depending on who you ask. So, but that feeds that debate about, you know, France, race, identity that's going on at the moment. And that seems to be very hard to avoid if you're watching French television and that sort of thing. So that plays well to a certain part of the electorate of, yes, you know, whether it's Jupiter, who was one of his nicknames in the early days, or the Napoleon thing now. I don't know if we're going to celebrate Napoleon III anytime soon. But that also, you know, attempting to talk about this, it's placing him in a certain side of that debate that seems to be dominating. I mean, it's like left-right issues seem to have completely disappeared, and it's everything is more in the sort of Galtan axis of party competition, if you want, you know, and fundamentally a lot of it is on the tan side, where there seems to be a lot of parties placing themselves there at the moment. So there's kind of a it's working well for a significant part of his electorate, I think, which is interesting because part of his appeal initially was actually quite at the other end of the spectrum on some of these ideas, or he actually appeared to have a certain being much more relaxed on identity questions than his presidency has demonstrated.
Can I add something?
If you want, yeah, go ahead.
So one thing, like, I'll tackle the question from a completely different angle because I'm not well placed to discuss, you know, the influence, you know, on the electorate, etc., and how these, you know, authoritarian personality traits might sort of you know, appeal to some part of the electorate. But what I want to highlight is like talking about this presidency, etc., there has been a lot of focus on the personal characteristics of Macron, the personal traits, and you know, he's the president of the rich, and he's authoritarian, and he's this, and he's that, and that, you know, was happening also under other presidents, like when Sarkozy was like, still he was, you know, treated as the emperor, and you know, like he was also characterized as this very, very authoritarian personality. And I think what we need to talk about, or at least that's where I would put the emphasis, is that we need to take into account the context which is conducive, let's say, to the emergence of such, you know, authoritarian kind of presidents, let's say, because I don't think that it's only a matter of Macron's personal traits and his traits as a president, but the real challenges of governing France in this point in time, you know, makes it very likely that someone will adopt this authoritarian approach, because the contradictions are such, because you are faced with a social movement that is against you and against your economic reforms, and justifiably so. But that means that, you know, the state can respond by using, you know, its strong hand and becoming more and more authoritarian. So I think that this is not about Macron himself, but about a wider trajectory in which the French state becomes more and more authoritarian, and diverse governments need to have recourse to more and more authoritarian means to pass laws, you know, by shortening parliamentary procedures and forcing laws through parliament, or by using, you know, the police, basically. But I think it's part of a wider trajectory which lends to the emergence of these, you know, authoritarian kind of presidents. And if it's not Macron tomorrow, it will be someone else, I think.
All right, thank you. If anyone else wants to answer.
Yes.
Oh, go ahead.
So just to answer your question, Alex, and also building on Elodie and Alexis, I agree with Alexis when you say that Macron is actually quite authoritarian. I would say even more than the previous presidents. But if I had to give one characteristic to Macron, especially if we look at what happened with the Yellow Vest, but even before, and what I think that part of the population sees in this president is his arrogance. I think the arrogance of Macron, I mean, maybe it's just a perception for part of the population, is also what could make him lose the election. Again, not any prediction, but what I'm saying is that he has, like La République En Marche has a way of showing contempt for the people, and a way of being so confident that previous presidents didn't show with so much in such an obvious way. I mean, if we look at Sarkozy, we wouldn't say that Sarkozy was particularly arrogant. We would say more that he was vulgar, you know, like vulgar. I think the vulgarity is really what has been said a lot about him. But I think that Macron, especially coming from a party that was literally like built on scratch, even though like it had people from the center right and the center left, like that they were this new party, and they won the election very quickly, the presidential election, and then the legislative election in 2017. So I would say that being too sure of themselves is the main problem of La République En Marche. And I would also say that this is something that has really appeared during the Yellow Vest protest, like we are the elite and you are the populace, and you just have to do the way we tell. So I would say, if I had to just summarize Macron in one quality, one characteristic, I would say definitely arrogance, which goes with his anti-populist ideology or strategy. Yeah.
If I can also do a very short comment on, I totally agree with Soraya. What I would say is that, I mean, we've been talking about populism, and of course, this word, the P word. Uh, we can also describe populism as a political style, and I like Benjamin Moffat's book on this. And if we think Macron, he has some elements of a populist style. When he was elected, he tried to present himself as someone more distant and more formal and, how can I say it, someone who respected this ceremonial dimension of the presidency, which was not the case with Sarkozy, and which was not the case with Hollande either. But with time, he started to be more, I don't know if vulgar is the term, but he started to do some statements and to discuss with people on the streets and to argue with people and to use and to, I don't know, use kind of common language. So when a protester, a yellow vest protester, approached him, he said, "Les carburants, c'est pas bibi." It's basically, it's not, I cannot even translate it, but it's like, it's not me and it's not Muggins here. It's like, it's not, and this without another important element, maybe the core element of populism, that is the opposition between the people and the elites, that was present to a certain extent, even in Sarkozy, it makes him arrogant. I think is this, he has this transgressive dimension of populism without the opposition, the people against the elites. So this is just my.
All right, thank you very much. So it seems like we don't have any more questions, so I think we're going to finish there. But just before, I'm going to thank the panelists for coming along and giving us this very interesting talk and answering all our questions. I'd like to thank everyone who came along and the people who organized this, and thank you to PolSoc for letting me chair this event. I think that's it.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
very much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you very much, and thank you, Alex, for chairing it, and thank you to the organizers and for the invitation. It was, and for my colleagues for the sharing their views on the matter. Yeah, this was very interesting. Thank you very much.